Suppose you acknowledge that maybe there is some kind of problem with carbon dioxide. It's not as great as the other people say, but suppose, because you're conservative, well, if there's any kind of concern, we ought to deal with it. And you can even support carbon pricing. But what you then say, because you don't want the government to dominate this field, if you're going to institute a carbon price or any kind of pollution price, you ought to reduce other taxes by the amount that's connected by that price, so it does not become a tax burden on the consumer. Secondly, you eliminate subsidies, because subsidies corrupt a pricing mechanism. So you got to be revenue neutral. If you're going to do this, you got to be revenue neutral. You got to eliminate subsidies, and you got to negotiate with your trading partners to make sure they're kind of on the same wavelength, or else you penalize yourself for being environmentally responsible. And the other thing you say, if you're going to apply a pollution pricing mechanism to hydrocarbons, the production of energy from hydrocarbons, you ought to apply it to every other energy source, or you distort the market.
All right, next section of your book talks about developing intellectual capital. In some ways, conservatives are very wonky. They're very policy focused. And so it seems maybe strange to talk about us not having sufficient intellectual capital, but we're weak in some pretty key areas.
Now, conservatives are strong on the economy side, and that's vitally important. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying we should diminish the emphasis there. But there are other dimensions that people are worried about where I think conservatives need to develop better ideas and communicate them better.
Let's talk for a minute about Donald Trump. I don't want to talk too much about him, because I think we often get overwhelmed by American conservatism and think it reflects on our conservatism, where I think Canadian conservatism is different, and probably Western conservatism is different as well. But one of the things that he did identify was the disaffection of the blue-collar or working-class voter. And do you think that Canadian conservatives have a strong enough message to be able to attract that group into their voting coalition?
I think they have to be addressed, and they can be addressed. When I was in the political business, I would go to factories and that in southern Ontario and manufacturing. Has anybody here got a pay stub from your last paycheck? So some guy's fish in his pocket and say, yeah, here's one. And say, look, there's two ways you can get more money in your pocket. One is by talking your employer into giving you more. The other is to reduce this tax component that is being taken out of your paycheck. And in some of those auto plants, it was a big chunk. These people were well paid, but the taxes they were paying. So here I'm talking to working guys, but you have a vested interest in getting taxes under control. This is a conservative message, but it's addressed to workers. I think today one of the big increasing divisions, and I think it's illustrated by this COVID situation, is the privileged position of many, the public sector workers versus the private sector workers. Very few public sector workers have lost a job, lost an income, but hundreds of thousands of Canadians in the private sector have. So somebody that will look after your interests as well as the interests of the public service have been looked after, that ought to appeal, and that ought to be a message that conservatives could convey.
One of the things that surprises me, and this is where it gets challenging, is that I think that conservatism don't have a compelling enough environmental message to attract the younger generation, but it seems like those on the progressive side of the spectrum are abandoning their natural resource worker or working class worker because they're 100% focused on the environmental message. Maybe this goes back to the issue of balance again. And so how do you create a compelling environmental message that doesn't undermine your economic message?
I've been on this for a long time, and I start by saying, look, conservation and conservative come from the same root. The words almost sound the same. So there's nothing inherently anti-conservation or anti-environment in conservative position. Conservatives ought to be concerned about conservation, environmental protection. But the alternative approaches there is the answer to the need for environmental protection simple government intervention, government regulation, or is there a way to harness market mechanisms to environmental conservation, environmental protection? And I take people through a logic, and I ask people, tell me what's wrong with this, if there's something wrong with it. Every economic activity has an impact on the environment, because all resources are taken out of the environment in order to produce things. And ultimately, wastes from those processes are deposited back into the environment. So there's an inherent connection between the environment and the economy. Environment's not just an add-on. We think about resource extraction and production and distribution and consumption, and oh yeah, there's the environment. No, they're integrated right from the get-go. So I say, what's wrong with this logic? For every economic activity, we identify what the environmental impacts are, and some of them are negative. We devise measures to try to avoid or mitigate those negative environmental impacts. And we ought to incorporate the cost of those environmental protection measures in the price of the product or the service, so the people that are demanding it pay for the environmental protection that's associated with that. That's a market-based approach to dealing with the environment, as distinct from saying it's the government's got to intervene and do all this sort of stuff. And I think there's a place for Conservatives championing that market-based approach to environmental protection as distinct from what the other side is offering. But Conservatives have got on the kind of reactionary, the other guys got onto that environmental ground first, and so the Conservative reaction has been to just be against whatever it is they're talking about, which I don't think is adequate. We've got to come up with our own approaches and our own solutions. And there's a lot of literature that has been done on harnessing environmental or market mechanisms, environmental protection. There's a lot of resources to draw on if we would make that kind of commitment.
Well, let's talk about the big environmental issue, because I agree with you on a conservation front. When you're talking about maintaining landscapes and biodiversity, ensuring that you've got clean water and clean air, I think that there's a lot of common ground, regardless of where you are on the spectrum. But it seems like carbon dioxide and policies around that are the ones that are so polarizing, because when you start talking about market mechanisms, you're now talking about pricing. When you're talking about pricing, the way Conservatives see that is, oh, you want to put a new tax on. And so that's where it seems like there's a conflict.
Think it through. If you want to apply pricing, suppose you acknowledge that maybe there is some kind of problem with carbon dioxide. It's not as great as the other people say, but suppose, because you're conservative, well, if there's any kind of concern, we ought to deal with it. And you can even support carbon pricing. But what you then say, because you don't want the government to dominate this field, if you're going to institute a carbon price or any kind of pollution price, you ought to reduce other taxes by the amount that's connected by that price, so it does not become a tax burden on the consumer. Secondly, you eliminate subsidies, because subsidies corrupt a pricing mechanism. So you got to be revenue neutral. If you're going to do this, you got to be revenue neutral. You got to eliminate subsidies, and you got to negotiate with your trading partners to make sure they're kind of on the same wavelength, or else you penalize yourself for being environmentally responsible. And the other thing you say, if you're going to apply a pollution pricing mechanism to hydrocarbons, the production of energy from hydrocarbons, you ought to apply it to every other energy source, or you distort the market. So sure, the hydro guys don't create a lot of CO2, but they've flooded carbon sinks the size of Lake Ontario. Mm-hmm. So where's the reservoir levy if you're going to do this, apply this concept? The nuclear people don't produce a lot of CO2, but they produce one of the deadliest poisons known to man that requires billions of dollars to be spent to dispose of it. So where's the pollution levy for them? If you're going to do it for hydrocarbons, do it for everybody else. And then you can take the Trudeau carbon pricing regime, saying it's not revenue neutral, it's riddled with subsidies, they've not got a parallel arrangement with our trading partners, and it's not universally applied. So it's defective. You can oppose what they're doing, but don't oppose applying a market mechanism to environmental conservation. I think that's, if I was in the Parliament, that's how I would come at that Trudeau carbon tax.
Okay, so we've got a reservoir tax, a radiation tax. How would you deal with wind and solar if you're talking, because
well, just it's the same concept. I would apply it, say, well, what's the negative environmental impacts of wind towers? Our family was involved for a while in a small ranching operation in the Cypress Hills in southeastern Alberta, where there's some of the original buffalo grass, fescue, never been broken, buffalo grass, precious resource. You can raise cattle on it There was a proposal, I'm not sure where it's at now, for a wind farm down there, 86 towers. Okay. There's a road into every one of those towers. There has to be a road in to service them. If you drive a pickup truck across fescue 3 times, the next year there will be invasive species in the track of fescue, and there goes your fescue. So, okay, where's the mechanism to avoid or mitigate that? Well, how do you incorporate the cost of that in the price of the wind tower energy? In the end of the day, the wind power, although unreliable, and solar power on a scale of 1 to 1,000, it may be somewhat better than hydrocarbon energy, but it won't be the difference between 0 and 1,000. It'll be much closer. So if you're going to apply pollution pricing, apply it to them all. Or else you distort the signals. You underprice. You've internalized the environmental externalities for hydrocarbons, but you haven't internalized the environmental externalities for the other sources of energy. So you've underpriced them.
Can you talk a bit about, because I liked what you talked about earlier about this notion of balance, because I think this is an area where we've gotten completely out of balance. Yeah. It seems like the solution is to get to zero impact on the environment. But if you have zero impact on the environment of any of the things that we're talking about, then you'll have zero economic development. Yeah, so yeah. How do you get to some kind of balance?
Well, and again, I've drawn a bit of history. In the early days, when you had economic development, say in the oil patch, you didn't give a lot of attention to the environmental aspects. This is my generation going back a way. So then gradually said we should do environmental impact assessments for economic development. And the first ones that were done were wildly inaccurate because the oil patch underestimated the environmental impacts, but they had to submit these environmental impact assessments to public hearings at regulatory bodies, and gradually these things were criticized and modified by scientists and other input so that these environmental impact assessments became fairly accurate. The first ones weren't, but the final ones were. But if we want this balance we're talking about, I say every major environmental protection measure should be subject to an economic impact assessment. What's the economic impact assessment of this? And the initial ones that will be done by the environmentalists will be wildly inaccurate. They'll underestimate the negative economic effects because it's in their interest to do so. But if those statements are submitted to regulatory bodies subjected to third-party scrutiny, eventually they'll get better too. And so as a government, you're going to have, here's the environmental impacts of what we're doing, here's the economic impacts of what we're doing, and you can strike the balance. And what's been missing in Canada, where's the economic impact assessment of the Paris Accord? The government went and signed this thing. It's got enormous economic implications. There was never any economic impact assessment, certainly not submitted to the Parliament. Where's the economic impact assessment of the federal government's carbon tax regime? It's never been submitted. So you can't get the balance unless you do them both. And I would actually be in favor of federal legislation requiring every major health protection measure and every major environmental protection measure has to be subjected to an economic impact assessment so that the government can strike the balance between the two. And I think that ought to be a conservative position. It's a responsible position. It's a balanced position. And it's something different than what the other people are offering.
So how do you argue that to the younger generation? Because I guess what's going through my mind is Greta Thunberg becoming an international phenomenon. Everywhere she went to, tens of thousands of people would come out on the streets to support her ambition to get to zero emissions or phasing out fossil fuels by 2030. It seems like there's kind of an emotional and populist element that those who aren't talking about the balance that we're discussing, they're able to tap into that in a way that this discussion about balancing and the economic impact, it doesn't kind of tap into that same emotional element. How do we make the argument?
I just think we have to at least communicate this balanced position, and at least start by communicating it. I think it actually does have a lot of appeal to particularly Canadians who worry about getting out on the extremes either way. And also showing the next generation, if you don't strike this balance, you're going to be hurt on the economic side. You're going to be hurt on the taxation side. It's your jobs and your income that are going to be negatively affected if you don't get this balance right between environment and the economy. And you can wait until that hits or you can think it through and understand that it's going to happen. But it requires a major communications effort, adoption by conservative parties of what I call a green conservative position, not a reactionary one, but here's our solution to these problems. And if someone is hung up on the carbon tax or global warming, that look at some other area. Next to the production of CO2 from the burning of hydrocarbons, the two next biggest sources are cement production, which public sector that builds roads all over the place with cement has some responsibility for, and the hydro guys who build great big dams out of concrete have responsibility. And the next one is urban landfills, sources of CO2. So you don't want to fight on that front, then do something on this front, but don't do nothing, and make your position find balance between the two.
What I liked about how you started that is that there's an authenticity issue with conservatives. They need to be trusted that they care for people to listen to what their solutions are, and for you to tie it, conservation and conservatism have the same roots. And talking about ranching families, I think that establishes that emotional connection. So let's move on to the other area where conservatives aren't seen to care as much as those on the other side, and that is in the area of poverty alleviation. Yeah. And I'm not sure why it is, especially from where we started talking about the foundation of Western thought being know thyself, control thyself, give thyself. It seems like the notion of giving and caring for others and caring for your community, that should be so very strongly tied with conservatism, and yet it's not.
Well, and it doesn't have to come at it from a charitable angle. One of my starting points on the poverty question is that the major way we've attempted in the Western world to deal with poverty for the last, 75 years, maybe longer than that, has been to try to come at it through income redistribution, through progressive taxation. We take some money from the people that have got it and we give it to the people that don't. And then I ask, how successful has that been? Has that eliminated poverty? Has that eliminated poverty among Indigenous people in Canada? We've been trying this for 100 years. Maybe there's some role for that, but it's not working, and it's not been anywhere near 100% successful. So are there other alternatives?
May I ask you on that, though? Wouldn't somebody say, well, if we didn't do that wealth redistribution, imagine how much worse things would be? Well, then I say,
okay, here's an alternative approach, and that is to argue for the better distribution of the tools of wealth creation as distinct from the redistribution of income. And what are the tools of wealth creation? Education as to how to create wealth, not just general education. Access to markets, access to technology, access to capital. And there's a whole literature on this, of distribute the tools of wealth creation. And I have a great example of this. In fact, I get into it in this book. Years ago, when I was in the consulting business, a small group of fellows came down to see us from the town of Slave Lake on the south shore of Lesser Slave Lake in north central Alberta. The government, when my father was still in the premiership, he commissioned 7 studies on areas. There were pockets in Alberta that were not prospering the way the rest of the province was. One of them was that south shore of Lesser Slave Lake. Used to be a fishery in that lake. The fishery had died. There used to be mink farming along the south shore of that lake. That had died. And it was one of the poorest areas of the province. Well, anyway, these fellows from Slave Lake came down and they said that they wanted to establish a community development company that had 2 objectives. One was to earn a return on the capital it's invested, so it's a capitalist thing. But it would undertake some projects that were required in the town. One of the most immediate one was housing for oil field workers, because the oil field was starting to get in there. And so they created this little community company, and it was going to be a public company. So they're going to offer these people, some of them 3rd-generation welfare, they'd never owned a share in anything in their lives. They're going to offer them shares in this company. It took 18 months to raise $100,000. I ended up being president of this company. I used to get called from the Alberta Securities Commission chair and say, why are you trying to raise $100,000 through a public share offering, and you can't even raise that? Like this is the lowest minimum subscription we've ever given anybody. So give us time, because we got to tell people what this is all about. Eventually, they got this going. They managed to get a project going. We put them in contact with some of the oil companies that were coming in there. And so this is part of this distribution of the tools, contact with people that can be of use to you. They eventually got this project going. They got some investment from the oil companies. We talked the provincial government at the time, this would be the Lougheed government, instead of building a public building in all these little towns, why don't you give these guys a 20-year lease on office space? Because they can take that lease and they can get a commercial mortgage. They were having difficulty getting any commercial mortgages. So this is access to a market, access to a source of capital. So anyway, all of this was an exercise in distributing the tools of wealth creation as distinct from just more welfare into that area. 50 years later, I had to leave it because when I got in the political business, and they ended up getting professional management. Walter Twin, that was one of the Sawridge Band, was the chief. He was one of the Sawridge Band had 10%, but no one was allowed to own more than 10%. So, but 50 years later, they sold that entire company for over $55 million and redistributed that. Some of these are second and third generation of those first 300 shareholders. Now, this is dealing with poverty in an underdevelopment area through a better distribution of the tools to create wealth as distinct from just pouring more welfare money into that community. And that, there's all kinds of examples in the literature of that type of mechanism. Why can't conservatives champion dealing with poverty through the better distribution of the tools of wealth creation as distinct from dealing with it through income distribution through progressive taxation?
I love the story as well because because it was an investment, when you went to give the investment back to the energy companies, they said, wait a minute, we've already written this off as a charity.
They get into storytelling. One day I got a couple of the companies, Imperial Oil was active in that area, and Rainbow Pipeline, which was a combination of Mobil, Banff Aquitaine, I think, and Imperial. One day, I had a little consulting firm. I got a phone call from Bill Thwaites, who's the president of Imperial Oil, calling our little firm. And he says, I hear you're trying to get a social investment. We called it a social investment because they had this dual objective. He says, I hear you're trying to get a social investment out of Imperial Oil. And I explained to him what this was all about. He says, well, we don't have a concept of social investment. What are they trying to do? Well, I say they're trying to build this housing project. Well, he says, go to our real estate guy. And I said, no, I know what kind of return your real estate guy wants, and this project's not going to deliver that for a while. Well, he says, if it's a charity thing, go to our charity guy. I say, no, we're telling these people, you don't just go asking for a handout from the government or from you or anybody else. Well, he says, it'll have to go to the board. It's $25,000 from Imperial. Well, I thought he's putting me on, and he slams the phone down. Anyway, I got a call back in another 3 weeks. He says, I've taken it to my people. I can't believe he took it to the board. He says, and they say to give you the money. And he says, and I know you're going to run around Calgary telling people you got a social investment out of Imperial Oil, but as far as I'm concerned, his voice is rising. As far as I'm concerned, it's charity. And he slammed the phone out. Well, by golly, we got this thing going. They got this project going. They generated enough return. It was a joint venture, this housing project between the oil companies and the community company. They made enough money to pay the companies back. So we put on this dinner in Calgary for the Imperial Oil guys and Mobil guys. And the directors came down from Slave Lake. They handed them, here's your original capital back. Here's your dividend. It was 6%. It wasn't a lot, but it was a dividend. Here's your dividend. And I wrote the Thwaites, we took pictures of it all and say, here's your guys getting your money, and here's your dividend, and this ain't charity. And the funny thing was that the Mobil representative was Ed Braden from Mobil. He came to me after this little dinner. It was all sweetness and light and pictures. He says, we got a problem. I said, what's the problem? He says, we all treated it as if it was a charity. So the accountants won't know what to do with these checks. So he says, is there something you could give it to up there in Slave Lake? And there was a senior citizens project or something, so the money went around twice. But this experience of those local people with getting the tools of wealth creation was invaluable, and it produced a lot of wealth in that. I
guess the thing I find remarkable about that story is that it's such an obvious way to make a small amount of money go a long way. As you mentioned, if you are investing properly, it is genuinely investment. The money does come back.
Yeah.
And yet it seems whether it's a liberal or a conservative, the paradigm's different. Let's attract the big whale. If we can only attract Amazon and give them great tax breaks or give them a subsidy, then there'll be a whole bunch of activity that happens around them. Or if we could only get that pipeline built by putting $1.5 billion in it, or that petrochemical plant by putting billions of dollars into it. It seems like we need to flip that on its head. And why doesn't that happen? Why is it that it's always going after the big investment as opposed to the community building one?
On the political level, there's not the political headlines from this little company in Slave Lake. There's no, it's not the big splash. I mean, it's small and it's micro, and so it's not politically attractive unless you actually politically want to solve the problem or address the problem. But I think that mechanism is one that conservatives could champion. It's relevant all over the country, and it distinguishes them from the people that say the only answer to this is income distribution through redistribution through progressive taxation.
And maybe more important now, since that small business sector has had such a difficult year during COVID. Maybe this is the time to experiment with those. Let's talk about these next 3 areas as a group, because we mentioned them a little bit earlier, but it's a really hard sell talking about how you bring more free enterprise, how you bring more choice into the area of social services delivery, into the area of education, into the area of healthcare. I mean, healthcare becomes that topic nobody wants to tackle. Or even if they do, it's tackled in such a minuscule way that it doesn't have a big impact on the amount of dollars spent or how it's delivered.
Well, I think it's going to be forced, Danielle, by when the health budget of a provincial government gets over 50%. What it's eating into then is other good expenditures on other things. It's eating into the education budget. It's eating into the social services budget. So I think eventually we're going to be forced, as other countries have been, forced into a mixed system, public and private, with freedom of choice between the two. What's unfortunate is you have to wait until there's a disaster, or it's self-evident that we can't finance what we've got now. It's too bad we have to wait for that. Can't we anticipate this and do something? And there's been law cases. The Chauli decision by the Supreme Court actually established the fact you don't have to die on the waiting line waiting for public health care if there's an alternative. It was never acted upon nearly as it was only applied to Quebec, and it was never actually acted upon as strongly as it could have been. But there's been some movement in that direction. There's this Cambie case that's now before the BC courts. It'll probably go to the Supreme Court, trying to establish the fact that there's no constitutional barrier to setting up a mixed system. So that it's slowly moving in that direction. But the shame is that it has to wait until it's self-evident because the other system's going to collapse.
Tell me how you catch the wave. That's one of the earlier books that you wrote. It seems like there's a lot of waves happening on the political side of the spectrum for progressive voters. It seems like it'd be really difficult for conservatives to catch a wave of a new approach to addressing environmental issues or a new approach to developing healthcare. In fact, some of these issues, because there's such entrenched interests, you would almost get a counter wave. You get more people who are fighting against you to try to bring through some of these changes. So how do you turn some of these issues into that populism so that you can get enough support behind it so politicians have the courage to do it?
I used to use the wave analogy. So like when you're starting a new political party, and you can't raise enough money and enough support at the beginning to just make it an instant success. But what you do is you paddle out. You've got enough money to build a surfboard, so you build this little surfboard and you paddle out into the political waters, and you keep looking over your shoulder to a wave that comes along that you think you can get up on, and that's the one that you ride. In the 1980s, when reform started out, the pollsters said that only 25% of the public think deficit and debt and all this is a big problem. 75% don't think it's a problem. So you majoring on that is a mistake. But we're looking out there saying, well, we think there is a wave coming along here on that, and we're going to paddle, we're going to get up on it. And by golly, by the time we got to the 1993 election, all of a sudden, partly by crusading and not just our work, but the work of the think tanks, the advocacy groups, now the public support is up to 50% say that's a big problem, and that was a big part of our platform. We managed to get up on top of it. So I think that's one of the challenges, to watch for the waves that you can ride. In some cases, you can help to create the wave and use it to advance your conservative position. Now with respect to populism, and this is a huge subject, one of the things Canadians should recognize is that Western Canada has had more experience with populist movements, populist parties, and populist governments than virtually any other part of North America. And there's lessons to be learned from that. This populism is this bottom-up boiling up of political energy. It can be negative. It's not conservative or liberal. It can be both. It can be one. It can be the other. It can be something else. It can be dangerous if it gets out of hand. But if it's recognized for what it is, if you learn some of the lessons from it, and if it's properly led and managed, it can be turned into a positive force. It can be harnessed to something good. And the illustrations I use from Western Canada, women got the vote in Canada as a result of a populist movement. The first woman in Parliament was Agnes Campbell MacPhail. She was not elected as a liberal or conservative. In fact, they fought her election. She came up as a progressive. And the old progressive were the Farmers' Party of the 1920s. The famous five who got the women recognized as persons in law, Alberta-based, 4 out of the 5 of them were members of populist movements. The Farmers' Parties, the Progressive Parties, they got that. Control of natural resources in the hands of the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan was achieved by a populist government, United Farmers of Alberta, working with populists in Ottawa that had a minority power over the King government. Medicare, whether you agree with it or not, was started by a populist party, the CCF in Saskatchewan. Those populist forces can be channeled into achieving something good if they're properly led and managed. They can go rogue, but and so I think one of the challenges for conservatives is to understand populism and how can those populist forces be channeled in support of some of the objectives that conservatives want to achieve. Another point that can be made on this is that the critics of populism just say, well, you got these wild and woolly people that cause all kinds of problems. There's at least 2 cases in the West of the rank and file members of populist parties actually reducing the extremism of their leaders. The one case was with the CCF, was a socialist party created in Depression. They had doctrinaire socialists who believed the state should own the means of production. That was the principal plank of the Socialist Party. And when they formed a government in Saskatchewan, some of those ideological extremists said, now our principle is that the means of production should be owned by the government. So the government should own the farmland of Saskatchewan. Well, it took those practical farmers in Saskatchewan about 2 seconds to figure out this is not good. And they told these ideologues, if you take that position, you won't be the government here for 6 months. In other words, the rank and file moderated the extremism of some of their own leadership. And in Alberta, the social credit was created in the Depression with monetary reform was the whole answer to the Depression. And they tried to get it. You couldn't do it through a provincial government. The courts threw out their legislation. But there was ideologues in that party, extremists, who no matter what the problem was, monetary reform was the answer to it. And after the Depression was over, they insisted on this being a big plank of the platform. And the rank and file members of that party said to them, look, if you keep talking about that, we want you to just run the affairs of a provincial government. You won't be the government. So these rank and file can actually moderate the extremism of their leaders.
Do you see any little wavelets out there that the conservative movement could now ride? Or is it is the wave obvious when it comes? I mean, I look at what happened in the United States after the financial meltdown. That created a populist movement of the left and the right.
Yeah.
Again, the language, I'm sure I'm not using the right terminology, but Bernie Sanders used that anti-establishment wave to ride his leadership, and Donald Trump used that anti-establishment wave to ride it to the White House.
I think there's a prospect that when the economic and financial consequences of how the government has responded to this COVID-19 crisis, when that other shoe starts to drop, when people start to realize what the consequences are of you borrowing and printing money to the extent of $1 trillion of addition to national debt between 2019 and 2024, when those consequences start to hit home, I think there will be a reaction to that could be capitalized upon by people that believe in more fiscal responsibility. Now, again, what's unfortunate like that is the same with the health. Do we have to get to a crisis point before we react to these things that can be predicted, or can we do it in advance? And another analogy for dealing with populism that I use is from the oil patch again. As you know, in the oil patch, there's such a thing as a wildcat well that's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down below because it hasn't been explored much. And then there's a rogue well that it drills into a formation where there is oil and gas under enormous pressure, but the well releases the pressure. It can blow the drilling platform off the wellhead. It can catch fire. It can be extremely dangerous. When Leduc came in, the year after Leduc, there was Atlantic number 3 blew not far south of Edmonton. It spilled 10 times the amount of oil that was spilled by the Exxon Valdez within a couple of days. It was extremely dangerous. But there's a way to deal with it, and it's like populism. You punch down into the political strata, and all of a sudden you hit this pressure that there's an enormous amount of energy there if you can harness it, but it's dangerous if it's unharnessed. And one way of dealing with a rogue well is to drill in a relief well from the side. And if the angle has to be right, if it's too shallow, it won't take off enough pressure. If it's too deep, it can turn into a rogue well because it hits the same pocket. But if it's just right, it can take off enough pressure that you can establish valves and bring that energy under control and use it for useful purposes. Now, I used to argue that what Reform did in the 1980s was a relief well. There was a separatist sentiment in the 1980s, the West alienation. It's reviving again. And we identified with that. We said, you got a right to be mad, but instead of kicking the whole thing to pieces, why don't we try to reform the way the Federation works? We were the relief well that took off enough of that pressure and converted it into other uses. And so if there's a reaction to this, the economic and fiscal consequences eventually of this COVID-19 management, one of the challenges will be to channel that energy, because it'll be anger. I would not want to be in the shoes of Justin Trudeau when that shoe drops. I think the resentment that will generate will be unprecedented. But somebody's got to tap into that pressure and turn it into something constructive. And I would say that's one of the missions of the Conservative Party.
Well, because it could also create regional divides. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But let me ask about one more potential wavelet coming. Maybe this is just wishful thinking on my part, is that I love freedom. I love the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's shocking to me how Canadians were so acquiescent. It didn't matter if it was a Conservative government, an NDP government, a Liberal government. It's like the Charter was suspended and no one cared. And is there going to be some kind of backlash saying, that was fine during that time, but we want our freedoms back? Is there a potential that could be a wave?
I hope there is. That's one of the most alarming things to me as well, that you have virtually every right that's guaranteed by the Charter, from the fundamental freedoms, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the media, to the democratic rights, to the equality rights, to the right to gain a livelihood, which is one of the rights in the Charter. All of these have been infringed to the tune of hundreds of thousands of times. And I would hope that that's eventually going to produce a reaction that, again, what's the balance? You want health protection, but you want a balance of the protection of the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Charter.
All right. Before we leave this topic, I think you also have such another great story that you tell. And I didn't realize that you were such a budding scientist, but I know that one of the things that you think needs to happen is the conservative movement needs to develop a better relationship with scientists. And I want you to make the case to me, because after watching how COVID has been steered by technocrats and not had that balance, I'm less confident in the medical establishment, and I'm less confident in the things that the elites in the establishment tell me, and I'm less certain of whether some of the decisions are being scientifically guided. But you seem to think that this is a very important area for conservatives to develop ties
Well, yeah,
in.
because I think science has an awful lot to contribute in a lot of these problems that we're talking about, everything from the environment to health protection to technological advances for the economy. And I worry about there's not a very strong connection between the political class and the scientific class.
Mhm.
You can count on the fingers of one hand the genuine scientists in the Parliament of Canada. There's some with a social science background, but I'm talking about the hard sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, mathematics. There's a conference and I've been attending it ever since it started, called the Canadian Conference on Science Policy, they try to get political people and science people together just to get to know each other. It's well attended by scientists. There's still very few political people go to it, and I think it's something that should be encouraged, because science has so much to contribute on these efforts. But to get to the point you're making, I think what's happened in this case is you've got bureaucrats who are not necessarily scientists and politicians championing the science, becoming the spokesperson. And this has been my caution to my science friends. You people have got to become the spokespersons for your own science. Don't let political people or bureaucrats become the champion of it, because they will bend it to some other purposes. So one of the things I try to encourage my science friends to do is, you have to become more the spokesperson for your science, and don't let it be co-opted by the political people or the bureaucrats, because I think that is what has happened in this COVID case, and it's happened on the climate change case. But a better relationship between the science and the political community, I think, would be in everyone's interest.
That's a good point, because if you'd had that, you might have had a more balanced discussion from a range of commentators and a range of scientists and a range of medical officers.
Yeah. And in the science community, there's you advance a hypothesis, and it's open to debate and criticism. This cancel culture, if that's ever applied to the scientific community, it destroys the application of the scientific method. So the genuine scientists ought to be as concerned about cancel culture being applied, that if someone says something that you disagree with, then the whole intent is to shut them up, rather than to let's debate this and let the best position win. The science community's got a vested interest in. The other thing I say to the science community is to recognize, and the scientists like to hear this, that there's a dark side to science. There's not been every scientific advancement from fire to nuclear energy. There's been people that will turn it to negative consequences. And the science community itself has to recognize it and be in the forefront of providing protection from negative. Years ago, for 1 year, I taught a course at the University of Toronto on politics and the genetic revolution. Like, I didn't know anything about genetics, but so I would invite in the plant geneticists, and they would say tell the students what they were doing, all the things they're trying to do to enhance agricultural production through the application of genetics. Then I'd invite in the animal geneticists, and they'd tell the students all that. And then the human geneticists, the stuff they were doing to try to knock out inheritable diseases through gene therapy and all this very interesting, positive stuff. But the last guy I used to bring in, I used to call him Darth Vader, was a scientist from the Defense Department, from the bioterrorism section. And his lecture was all those wonderful things those other people are talking about. There are people out there who can turn that science into one of the deadliest weapons, biological weaponry, that's one of the cheapest ways to kill people. And so let me tell you about the dark side. And I think the more the science community itself recognizes the dark side and does whatever it can to protect against that, it increases their legitimacy in the political discussion.
Let me finish with a story that you told, because your budding science career got canceled by your neighbor because he thought you were building a bomb. Tell us, because I didn't realize you had such an extensive science background, but it explains a lot to me about why you've delved into these issues in such depth over the years. But
yeah, well, I attended this rural high school, the Horse Hill. It was a high school then. It still exists, actually, and now it's part of Northeast Edmonton. And I had an interest in science. And the principal of the school, is Mr. Krejci was his name. He was quite sympathetic to me and used to let me borrow science equipment from the school. And I borrowed hydrolysis equipment. And me and my friends were going to produce oxygen and hydrogen through hydrolysis. And our scheme was to put the hydrogen into balloons, which we were then going to shoot at with our 22s and create spectacular explosions. This never quite worked out. But then one time for Christmas, my folks asked me what I wanted for Christmas. I want a Geiger tube, which is you can use to detect radiation, Geiger counters. And so they found a Geiger tube, and I got it for Christmas. And then I got my father to ask the Alberta Research Council for a pitch blende that is radioactive. And then I made this Geiger counter, and I had my friends would hide the pitch blende, and I would go around with my Geiger counter and find it. You see, this was amazing science. But my little lab was in a room at the end of a bunkhouse where we had our hired man who helped milk the cows, and he heard me bragging, unfortunately, about hydrogen and radiation, because he thought I was one step away from the bomb. And so he told my father he'd quit unless they shut down this laboratory. So my budding science career was ended or else I'd have had to end up milking.
Well, I'm glad for that, because we've got you in politics. Let's take a break there, because I know that you want to really talk about, we've got a lot of work to do in setting the stage for how to advance some of these ideas, and that is going to take training. And we'll talk about that next.